Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another Video Fish Survive podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Dan McClellan. And today we're going to be discussing Yahweh and El, the two gods of ancient Israel. Last time we did this online. This is my first in-person interview with Dan McClellan. And we're going to be continuing this discussion on Yahweh and El, the two gods of ancient Israel. Because in ancient Israel, as we have covered several times before, ancient Israelites once believed in the existence of several gods. Some may call them polytheists, others may call them henotheists. But I know that those terminologies are tricky, especially depending on the time period we're talking about. And we're going to get into the technicalities of that today. So thank you for joining me, Dan.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Glad we were able to find some time during this conference.
Yeah, likewise. So when you look at something like the Divine Council in Psalms, does the understanding of the Divine Council change over time as the development of the Tanakh or the Old Testament continued throughout the centuries?
Yeah, absolutely. We start in the earliest periods. I think a lot of scholars have reconstructed a notion of the pantheon, the divine council, with El as the deity that rules over the divine council, and then according to a framework like Mark Smith's, where maybe you have 4 tiers to the divine council, you have the divine pair, El, and probably Asherah at the top, and then the second tier of deities were the Bnei Elohim, the children of God, and then perhaps there's a third tier of craftsman deity. In the Ugaritic literature, we have Kothar Wahatsis, who makes Baal's weapons and things like that. And then the bottom tier would be the servile class of deities, messengers and things like that. And so that's kind of a reconstruction of how the pantheon may have looked as we move from the early Iron Age into, or probably the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. And then probably somewhere around 1000 BCE, according to the way I reconstruct the history, you probably have Adonai coming in and originally entering the pantheon as a second tier deity, as a lot of scholars think Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 preserves, and probably appropriating the storm deity profile from Baal, the local Northwest Semitic storm deity. And then I would suggest shortly afterwards, there is a campaign of conflation where a king probably is trying to promote a conflation of Adonai and El and promote them as a single deity, and that may have taken a century or two. But then when we get down into the exile, I think in Psalm 82, I've published an article arguing that what Psalm 82 is doing is attempting to restructure the divine council, where prior to this time period, all the deities had their own national purview, their nation over which they were the patron, and they had sovereignty in that nation. But once you leave that nation, then you're in some other deity's purview. So, for instance, when Naaman comes into Israel and wants to go back to Syria, says, I want to worship Adonai. And how does he make that happen? He takes 2 cartloads of Israelite soil back with him so that he can worship Adonai on Israelite soil, since Adonai can only be accessed on Israelite soil. When David is being pursued by Saul, he's in the wilderness of Zin. He's near the borders of Israel, and he tells Saul that your men are forcing me out of the inheritance that is Israel, telling me to worship other gods. In other words, if I am not in Adonai's inheritance, again, Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, your inheritance is Israel, then I have to worship whatever God is sovereign in whatever territory I'm in. In the exile, the Judahites are outside of Israel. They don't have access to Adonai. And so I argue that Psalm 82 is condemning the gods of the nations for their negligence, for allowing the exile to happen. And by condemning them to mortality is basically deposing them and kicking them out of their seats on the divine council. And then the very last verse, the psalmist says, Kuma Elohim, rise up, O God, for you will inherit all nations. And so Adonai's inheritance goes from Israel to all the nations who no longer have patron deities over them. And in this way, Adonai's rule is universalized. Now Adonai is the direct ruler over all the nations. And I think in the later period, in the Persian and in the Greco-Roman period, rather than carrying on this notion that the gods of the nations are now dead, we still have Adonai's scriptural heritage. All these texts from earlier, the sons of God are mentioned in Genesis 6, they're mentioned in Job, They're mentioned in Psalm 29. They're mentioned in a bunch of places, and so we've still got to find some way to recognize that they're around. And this is where we get the idea of guardian angels over nations. And so basically, my argument is that the other tiers of the divine council all get squished down into the bottom tier, and so everybody becomes an angel. And so in Daniel 10, we have the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, and Michael the archangel is saying, "Oh, I was busy battling with these princes." This would be this concept that the prince of Greece and Persia are actually the guardian angels of Greece and Persia, what used to be their patron deity. Now it's just this angel that has dominion in the area. And so there's an exalting of Adonai while there's a demoting of everybody else, and this is increasing the distance between the lower deities and the high deity, and so they're all now angels in the Greco-Roman period, and so I think there are lots of changes in the divine council. And then when we get into the Common Era and into Rabbinic Judaism, we see these debates about how we interpret Genesis 6 and Psalm 82, because Genesis 6 is the conventional wisdom in the Greco-Roman period is these are angels who have come down, and the Enochic literature expands on this significantly. You've got the disobedient angels who come down and they've mated with human women and created these giants, and then their souls become the Nephilim, and on and on. But then there were some Jewish thinkers who were saying, wait a minute, how can an angel be disobedient? They have no agency. And then, wait a minute, how could an angel have children with human women? They're not sexually compatible. And so we have arguments about the sexual compatibility. And this is what Jude 1:7 is talking about when it talks about people seeking after sarkosoteras, other flesh. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was that humans were trying to sexually assault male angels who are not human flesh, but other flesh. And so there's an argument that, wait a minute, these probably aren't angels either, probably humans. And so we have the humanistic reading of Psalm 82, of Genesis 6, of other passages that refer to the Elohim and the B'nai Elohim. And so the divine council gets kind of humanized even more once we get into the rabbinic period because of these exegetical kind of priorities. We need to make better sense of this, make it fit better into our worldview about sexual compatibility, about whether or not angels can be disobedient. And so there's a continual kind of smushing down of these other deities to servile deities, to angels, and now we're not even allowing them to be divine at all. They're just humans. So I would say the divine council changes quite a bit over the centuries.
And I find it interesting that when you point out that there are other places in the Old Testament where it tells you that some, like this individual you were talking about earlier, that took cartloads of Israelite soil with him to have basically a mobile Israel. Call it that. And because he wants to take the pieces of Israel with him, so he's still under the jurisdiction of Adonai. And that to me really refutes what apologists try to say about Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 and 9. Say, actually, it's Adonai inheriting from himself. But how do you explain these other references?
It causes more problems than it solves, but you're also creating this notion that somebody creates an inheritance and then they take it for themselves. And the number of the nations, the idea is, if you look in the Ugaritic literature, there are the 70 sons of Asherah. And so the idea is 70 is just kind of a generic round number for lots of things. So you have the 70 sons of Asherah. And if you look in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, you have 70 different ethnic groups. And so there's a convention that there are 70 nations in the earth. And so Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 is probably preserving this idea that there are 70 nations. And so divided up the nations according to the number of the B'nai Elohim would be 70 nations, 70 B'nai Elohim. But if Adonai is taking Israel for themselves, then there would be 71 nations, because there would be 70 nations plus this extra nation that is not going to one of the B'nai Elohim, but is going to the one distributing the nations. And so there are a bunch of reasons it just doesn't work that way. It makes a lot more sense to have these two deities being separate.
When you look at the Septuagint's version of Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 compared to the Qumran version, Which one is closer to the original? Because I know that they're very identical and both are very different, the Masoretic version.
Yeah, so scholars actually posited this theory that Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 originally referred to the Bnei Elohim, the children of God, because of the Septuagint, because it says that the Most High divided up the nations according to the number of the angels of God. And we know that the Septuagint translators liked to render angels when the text says gods. So, for instance, in Psalm 8, it says, I made you a little lower than the gods in the Hebrew. The Septuagint says, made you a little lower than the angels. So that's what we see in the book of Hebrews. In Job, when it talks about the sons of God shouted for joy at the foundation of the earth. In the Septuagint, it says angels. And so they thought, I wonder if it said B'nai Elohim here or Elohim, and the Septuagint translators just changed it to angels of God. And then the discovery of 4Q Deuteronomy J kind of confirms that theory where it reads B'nai Elohim. And so I think most scholars would say that's probably closer. There is an argument from one scholar that it probably originally said B'nai Sar El, which would be the children of Bul El. And the argument is that B'nai Sar El would more easily be misunderstood as B'nai Israel, because that's how the Masoretic text reads. And so that's one argument, but not a lot of scholars have accepted that argument. So it most likely said either B'nai El or B'nai Elohim.
In the Masoretic text, did they make any attempt to change the other stories that talked about these individuals taking soil with them in order to stay within the inheritance, or did they keep it the way it is and they just tried to make it work with the reimagining of Deuteronomy 32?
I don't think we see any changes in that regard, because that idea that taking the soil, I don't think they were like, we need to hide any evidence of this original ideology. That could be reinterpreted in a number of different ways. That's not like a smoking gun that, they thought Adonai's authority didn't extend past the land of Israel. So I don't think there are any textual variants that would show an attempt to try to obscure that reading.
Was there also occasions where Adonai wasn't just conflated with El, but also with Baal? And if so, is that the reason why Hosea, in chapter 2, it says, Those shall no longer call me Baali, my master, but call me Ishi, my husband?
Well, just like the word El can mean God, as in just a deity, or it can be the proper name of the Israelite high deity, Baal can be a generic noun. It can be used to mean master, lord, or even husband. And so Baal was almost certainly a title that was used to refer to Adonai. And what we see in Hosea is this is probably where the conflict with Baal is most acute, and this is probably giving rise to the contest of Elijah with the prophets of Baal. And then in Hosea, you probably have, we don't want to hear that name anymore. And so where we used to call Adonai Baal, as in master, we're just going to avoid it altogether. So don't call me Baali anymore, call me Ishi, means don't call me my husband using the term Baal, call me my husband using the term Ish. And so that's probably just a shift in that regard, because we have one of Saul's sons is in the Masoretic text, it's Eshbal in one passage, and Eshbal is mentioned a handful of different times, which means man of Baal, or man of the Lord, or man of the master. And so if this is just a title for Adonai, it's no big deal. But then we have another version of the same story, and I forget which one's in Chronicles and which one's in Samuel. It's probably Samuel where they alter it, but they've altered the name, and the name is Ishbosheth, which means man of shame. And so it's kind of an editorialization. Oh, his name was Baal. We're going to change it to shame just because we don't like that name. The guy's a moron. So we're going to call him man of shame from now on. When he had that name, if he did historically have that name, it probably would have been understood as a reference to Adonai. So I don't know that there was an actual conflation of the two, just because they were both trying to occupy the same divine profile. So there was probably conflict, but I'm not totally positive about that, because you also have at Kuntilat Ajrud, you have one of these inscriptions that's preserved, we have the Adonai and his Asherah inscription, but there's another inscription where we have the word El, the name Adonai, and the word Baal all used within this little inscription of only a handful of lines. And it could just be that these are titles being used to refer to one deity. It could be that they're referring to three different deities: the high deity El, Baal, the storm deity, and Adonai, another storm deity. It could be that Baal is a separate deity, and El/Adonai have already been conflated. So that kind of complicates things a little bit. I'm not sure exactly how to reconcile all of that, but it seems to me that Baal, I would say I'm probably 70-30 convinced that Baal, when it's used in reference to Adonai, is more a title meaning master or lord than it is identifying Adonai with the deity Baal.
What other ways they tried to address the divine council? Did they try to just say in general that, okay, these are just angels, don't worry about it, they're not deities? Did they try to later obscure that completely and just say these are all angels?
Well, the all angels things would be Greco-Roman period, but one of the things that they do in between the earliest periods and that is basically try to cast the gods of the nations as either just astral deities. So like Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 says the Most High divided up the nations according to the number of the children of God. Deuteronomy 4:19 says, when you look up into the heavens and you see the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the host of heaven, who were given to the nations. And so here it's Adonai distributing not the nations to the gods, but the gods to the nations, and characterizing them as just the astral bodies. And so there's an astralization of the deities, which is probably an attempt to kind of depersonify them and just say, oh, they just worship the sun, the moon, and the stars like a bunch of losers. But we've got Adonai as our deity. There's rhetoric of incomparability. Who can compare to Adonai? So we see that in Psalm 68. We see it in Psalm 29, for instance, where you have a tribute to Adonai, glory, all you, and there it's B'nai Elohim, children of the gods. And so there's a lot of exalting Adonai over the other gods and kind of minimizing their influence, and also characterizing them as just the host of heaven. So the kind of nameless, faceless, just military agents who fight on behalf of Adonai. So Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, talks about the Canaanite general Sisera, and it says in one part, the stars fought in their courses against Sisera. The idea being the stars are the host of heaven, they're these astral deities, and they work for Adonai. So there's subordinating of the gods to Adonai the whole time as well.
I'd like to shift a little bit to these enemies Adonai, like Moloch, for instance. I know that scholars, and you've also talked about this recently in a video you did, that there's no evidence attesting to the existence of a Canaanite, Ugaritic, or Phoenician deity called Moloch.
Right. We've not found any inscriptions that are contemporaneous with these writings in the Hebrew Bible to any deity named Molech, much less a deity named Molech who was a recipient of child sacrifice. But almost a century ago, we made the discovery of a bunch of infant burials in Carthage, in and around Carthage, and there are Punic Phoenician inscriptions that use these consonants MLK, Mem Lamed Kaf, which is exactly what the name Molech uses for the consonants. And it's pretty clear, scholars are pretty sure that these were not miscarriages, these were not sudden infant death syndrome, these infants were sacrificed. And they're put in jars, for instance, and there's inscriptions associated with them that say this is a Molech for Baal, or something like that. There are a bunch of different variations on the formula, but the term is used in a way that suggests that Molech, or however it was vocalized, was a type of offering, a type of sacrifice. And sometimes it's a child, sometimes it's money in place of a child, sometimes it's an animal in place of a child. But we have several instances where it is a Molech for Baal, or for a deity, which suggests to many scholars, and I think we're probably closer to half and half right now than to having a strong consensus. But I would hope it's moving in the direction of a consensus among scholars that this term referred to a type of sacrifice. And the only place where it is more clearly a reference to a deity is in the Septuagint, in the later Greek translation of these passages. And then in the New Testament, we have in the book of Acts this reference to the Star of Remphan, and it talks about a pedestal or something for Molech. So I think there was probably a reinterpretation that took place in the Greco-Roman period where they were uncomfortable with the notion that this was a sacrifice meant for Adonai, and so reread the name of the sacrifice as the name of the deity who was the recipient of the sacrifice. And that kind of distances Adonai from having accepted any such sacrifices, and then generates this new boogeyman, basically, for these people. And yeah, it's only within the last century, I think, that we found strong evidence of what actually happened.
So perhaps I suppose one could put it this way, that albeit Moloch may have been used as a term of like, okay, I Moloch this to this god. So that's basically the term's being used as like I'm giving this object or person as a sacrifice to this deity. And this Carthaginian deity that is sacrificing these infants to Balu Haman or Baal Haman, could one say that even though they're using the term Moloch or Molech incorrectly as a name of a deity, that in some sense it's a garbled memory of a reference to Balu Haman, the deity that they're sacrificing the babies to in the first place?
It's possible, but that's what's going on in Carthage, and so I don't know what kind of knowledge anyone in Israel would have had of this.
Okay.
And certainly it is possible that they are referencing a practice that went on in the land of Canaan. So it could be that they were offerings to whichever iteration of Baal was being worshipped in that time and place. But we do have the reference in Exodus 22:29, where God says, "You shall give me all your firstborn sons. You shall give me." And then in verse 30 says, "And you'll do the same thing with your oxen and your sheep," and which seems a pretty clear command to sacrifice firstborn children. And it's only later passages, or at least passages that most critical scholars agree come from later literary layers like Exodus 13 and Exodus 34, that we have this command to redeem them, which in my opinion, you don't say, well, let's command them to sacrifice children, but we would never actually require that. So let's start with this redemption. You would really just not ever have the commandment in the first place if the intent was to never sacrifice children. So it makes much more sense as somebody kind of, oopsie, let's command them to redeem these children, because we can't really just erase Exodus 22:29 and then in Ezekiel 20:25 and 26, you even have Ezekiel who seems to refer to this, where he has God saying, I gave you commands that were not good and that made you sacrifice your children. And basically the plan was to desolate you and show you who's boss. So we have another witness in the Hebrew Bible to the idea that Adonai at some point commanded Israel to sacrifice their firstborn children.
And therefore, when some try to say, "Oh, Adonai is special," you see, he didn't command child sacrifice. Yes, he did.
I would say the data support that interpretation, that conclusion, that, and we even have the story of the command that Abraham sacrificed his child, and then the entire New Testament is built on the premise that God offered his firstborn child as a sacrifice. So child sacrifice is not something that is totally anathema to these traditions. It actually has a role, even if there are little nuances that allow them to kind of say, well, God stopped Abraham right before he did it. And there are scholars who will argue that in the original version of the story, God didn't stop Abraham. That in the original version of the story, Abraham sacrificed Isaac. But since these stories are being brought together to try to create this genealogical lineage where everybody is in the same family, it becomes necessary to have Isaac be redeemed. So there are a handful of different theories, but I think the data best support the conclusion that there was a period when at least the text commanded it.
Right.
It's certainly plausible, some would say probable, that such sacrifices never actually took place. We certainly have no data that indicates children were sacrificed.
Is there any data at all, or is it just total speculation that in the original story of Abraham and Isaac, that Abraham did actually kill Isaac?
I think it's speculation. I don't. There are no textual data that point in that direction. It's not like we have a manuscript where it happened. I think it's based on the reconstruction of how these stories came together. I think there are scholars who suggest it would make more sense in the way that they've reconstructed them if Abraham did carry through with it. So yeah, that's pretty speculative.
Is it possible that another reason that they are changing the information because they not just because they later came to the conclusion that okay, this is bad, we can't have Adonai being portrayed as someone demanding infant sacrifice
Mm-hmm.
of firstborn. Uh, could it be that another reason being done to obfuscate that was because they don't want Adonai to look like or act like he's no different than other deities as part of the streamlining towards monotheism?
I don't know if I would say as part of the streamlining towards monotheism, but I think that's certainly possible as a means of differentiation.
Okay.
There are some scholars who coined the term schismogenesis, and that's where you create a difference, which then becomes an identity marker. What's the story from? Is it Gulliver's Travel, where they have one community where they butter one side of their bread and the other where they butter the other, or they eat the egg from one end of the egg, and then in the other community they eat the egg from the other end of the egg, and that's like the cause of wars and stuff. And so that would be an example of just kind of an arbitrary, kind of totally meaningless difference becoming a source of becoming a central identity marker. That would be schismogenesis. And so you do have this idea you don't worship Adonai the way the nations around you worship Adonai. And so certainly that could have been one of the motivations for emphasizing this. I mean, that would be low-hanging fruit. How are we going to differentiate ourselves? Well, maybe we don't kill our kids like everybody else does. Good idea. Write that down. So yeah, it's absolutely plausible that that's one of the motivations for it.
When it comes to the formation of these texts, where do you think they're getting these ideas, and what kind of sources do you think they were using when they were trying to create the history of Abraham and Jacob and all these other characters? And because when they create these characters, we also see a timeline forming of like theological changes and how the theology evolved over time to becoming uh, to them going from acknowledging from multiple deities to only there being one deity.
Yeah, and we have Abraham, for instance, saying there's one. I think it's in Genesis 20, where Abraham. Most translations will say God led me or drove me out of the land of my fathers, and the verb there is plural. The gods drove me out of. And so, yeah, there are indications that there are multiple different deities going on here. There are folks who would say that the dread of Isaac or the fear of Isaac could also be the bull of Isaac. There's maybe a reference to another deity, and you've got El Olam and El Berit and all these different titles that a lot of scholars suggest these could have been originally distinct deities that were worshipped locally in whatever part of the land these different patriarchs came from. I think a lot of scholars would say that the patriarchal narratives, the cycles of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were originally independent. These are probably traditions that came from somewhere in the northern kingdom where these were people from different tribes, and there were stories that were circulated about them. And so the changing of names seems like a pretty convenient thing to happen. And one theory is that there was a dude named Israel, there was another dude named Jacob. Our country's called Israel, and we put these stories together, and at some point somebody said, let's just say Israel was Jacob, and God changed his name at one point. So I think there are a lot of good indications that these were independently circulating narratives and stories that got brought together. And Andrew Tobolowsky has a great book on the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, and how they were formed in a much later time period, at least the lineage and the identity, in order to create a narrative of kinship as a way to maintain some social cohesion. where you probably have conflict. And in the Hebrew Bible, you do have conflict, the North and the South constantly in conflict, one tribe constantly in conflict with another. And then if you create this narrative of kinship, you now are motivated to get along with them. And, we're Israel, we all descend from Abraham, we got to get along. And so that's probably part of the rhetorical goal of creating this single genealogical lineage. But somebody like Andrew Tobolowsky would be able to explain that a lot better than I can.
I find it interesting that if Jacob and Israel are a conflation of two separate individuals, it kind of reminds me. I know it's not quite the same thing, but we see doublets, like there are two stories: Abraham becoming Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
or the two different versions of the flood story,
Mm-hmm.
two different versions of the creation story. So when we see two on two going on, are these different Judean communities that are creating different stories based on Mesopotamian stories that they've heard about, and they're creating new stories that are somewhat similar but different one another, and then a later redactors combining the information that later ends up in the Pentateuch.
I think we probably have. I don't know if we can say they're pulling directly from Mesopotamia, but certainly there are different versions of these stories in circulation. So, for instance, Joseph being sold into Egypt. Right now, it's a very convoluted narrative. You can't tell what's going on, and to make it make sense, you have to just gin up scenarios that are not in the text, or you can disentangle the text, and this is particularly true where we have Ishmaelites and Midianites. You can disentangle the text and you have two beginnings, two middles, and two ends, and they each tell perfectly cohesive and consistent narratives, one involving Ishmaelites and one involving Midianites, and one where the brothers pull Joseph out and sell him to the Ishmaelites, and the other where the brothers are debating what to do, and Midianites come by and go, "What? Jackpot!" and pull him out, and they leave, and then Reuben comes back and goes, "Oh crap, where'd he go?" So yeah, there are examples of these conflations, but they're probably regional differences. Like this story gets told a certain way in this town, whereas in this town the story gets told in a slightly different way. But you also have some change over time, because when you look at Exodus 6:3, we've got God introducing themselves to Moses, and God says, your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew me as El Shaddai, but by my name Adonai they did not know me. But you can go look in Genesis and you can see each of them on their own explicitly calling out the name of Adonai, which suggests that whatever version of the patriarchal narratives the author of Exodus 6:3 had, they either they did not have a version of the narratives where Adonai is present, or that was one of those regional variations, and they went with the version where Adonai is not there. But then what gets preserved in our version of Genesis is the one where Adonai is there. So there are so many different layers, and it's phenomenally complex. But certainly there are multiple different versions of the stories, because you also have different characters who run into Abimelech and say, "Oh, this is my sister," and not my wife. And Abimelech is like, "All right, well, I'm gonna do my thing," and then finding out, wait a minute, this is your sister. Like there are two different characters that happens with. So we also have different characters who are the same story is being told with different main characters. So I don't know that we will ever be able to disentangle it and figure out exactly where the original narratives are coming from.
Unless maybe we start finding manuscripts of whatever EPDRJ look like.
Yo, man,
or more.
That would be the coolest thing in the world. That would change everything. But I'm not going to hold my breath.
Right. Because the sad reality is there are certain things that are going to remain lost in history.
Yeah. There are probably some texts that there were only one or a few copies of, and they were destroyed long ago, and it's just gone forever.
Right.
Which is so awful to think about. But but we can only hope that we'll find stuff soon.
Yeah, we'll see. Never know.
Yep.
We found plenty of stuff lately.
Yeah, plenty of surprising stuff.
Do you think when the redactor looked at all these different stories, okay, yeah, we're talking about similar people. Maybe they weren't originally the same. He doesn't know what to do. And he felt like, if it's he anyway that's doing it, but whatever. like this person's like, let me just conflate them. Let me just put these stories together because I don't know what else to do. I don't know which one I prefer. So let me just shove them in together and pretend this La La Land, no problem.
I think we have some examples like the selling of Joseph to Egypt, like the flood, where they did try to weave them together in a way that they could make sense of. Even if today we're like, that doesn't make sense. Somebody at some point was like, yeah, we can work with that.
Right.
But we have examples of that in like Deuteronomy 32:43, where in the Masoretic text it's I forget exactly what it says, but it's pretty brief. But the Septuagint is double the length, and so it kind of doubles the structure that we see in MT, but the content is entirely different. It's like bow down to him, all you gods, and give him strength, all you angels of God. And then we find the Qumran version of that verse, and it says, "Bow down to him, all gods," and which is what we find in Psalm 97:7. And so, at least for the Septuagint, it seems like what happened is they had two different versions of this, either in translation or in Hebrew, and they just kind of went with, keep them both. We'll just stick them both one after the other because it's very repetitive, the two different variations on what we have in the Qumran reading. So it certainly happened in the transmission of the biblical text, and we can see it happening in its translation into Greek. And it's interesting that Psalm 97:7 seems to be quoting the original version of Deuteronomy 32:43, which is different in the Greek and then completely different in the Masoretic text. And in my opinion, the creation account in Genesis 1 and then the creation account in Genesis 2:3 were probably kind of incidentally combined. Somebody probably was like, I got to make a new version. I've got two different creation accounts. We'll just put them both down, and that way we're preserving both of them. And it's not my fault if they don't make a lot of sense. And now we have the story as it exists now, which people have been trying to make sense of for thousands of years.
And aren't there other times where, on occasion, the Septuagint will not just, sometimes they'll have a longer version of one story, which we just talked about an example of that. But there are times we'll have the shorter version of the story. So kind of like alternating primitivity between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, or maybe even with the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the older tradition of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, I think we have. So most of the texts were the works of different translators, so it's not the same translation technique every time. But yeah, Jeremiah, for instance, is about 1/6 shorter in the Septuagint version than it is in the Masoretic text. And then we have indications from Qumran that may have been in the Hebrew source text. So maybe Jeremiah has been significantly expanded since the time of the Septuagint. And then there are other places where the orders are different. So yeah, it's a mixed bag when we get to the Septuagint. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter, sometimes the order is different, sometimes the words are different. So there's no one rule. This is what the Septuagint translator always does. So you have to really come at everything on a case by case basis and try to figure it out on its own terms. Because it would be convenient if we could just say, okay, this manuscript from the Qumran is always right, and in this book the Septuagint is always right. But it's never that simple. It's a lot more. It's a lot messier than that.
This really goes to show about the redactions. The redactional period to the Pentateuch really lasted a very long time, even after the time of Jesus, both of the Masoretic texts.
Yeah, I think the texts that were in circulation around the time of Jesus would have been different. Those that were circulated in Hebrew or Aramaic, because we've got the Targumim, which probably started out as oral translations into Aramaic that were later written down. They differ in a lot of ways. The New Testament is written in Greek and is largely quoting from Septuagint versions of things. So yeah, the text has not yet stabilized, but I think around the time of Jesus, it is moving towards stabilization. It's about a century after Jesus that we begin to see indications that the Masoretic tradition is kind of reaching a point where it's considered widely authoritative, at least a proto-Masoretic tradition. But yeah, in Jesus's time period, the text was still very much in flux.
And then my closing question, in general, do scholars consider that the Dead Sea Scrolls are closer to the original text than the Septuagint, or is that not always a blanket case?
It's certainly not a blanket statement, but I think I think the instances where the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve earlier readings
Mm-hmm.
probably outnumber the instances where the Septuagint preserves earlier readings. But you also have among the Dead Sea Scrolls, you also have multiple manuscripts of individual texts, and so you have different readings just among the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, and so it gets a lot more complex than that they always had the better text, because even among themselves they had texts that had better and worse readings. So it's just a big mess. So everything's got to be taken on a case-by-case basis.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dan McClellan.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.